Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to be taking a deeply emotional and honestly incredibly fascinating journey through the history of mental health treatment right here in America. We're going to look at one specific, monumental structure that really embodies both our absolute highest hopes and our most profound failures when it comes to caring for the vulnerable. We are unpacking the complex history of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in Weston, West Virginia.
I must be in heaven. Now, hearing that is pretty surprising, right? Because usually when we think of 19th and 20th century mental institutions, our brains immediately jump to horror movies. But this quote, which comes from a former patient remembering the holidays at the asylum, it establishes the genuine utopian optimism that existed during its early days. You know, it wasn't built to be a house of horrors. It was actually built to be a sanctuary.
But the story of this building is one of just stark, tragic contrast. We're looking at a hospital that drastically devolved over the course of about a century. It began as this utopian healing sanctuary designed to cure mental illness with fresh air and dignity, and it ultimately transformed into a dangerously overcrowded institution marked by neglect and some highly controversial medical procedures. So how exactly did we get from point A to point B?
Well, it all kicks off with a totally revolutionary concept for the time called moral treatment. Back in the mid-19th century, a pioneering physician named Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride theorized that the physical building itself could literally act as a cure. Just imagine that. Instead of locking people away in city jails or chaining them up in almshouses, Kirkbride advocated for moving them to a rural, beautifully ornamented environment. The whole idea was that architecture, natural light, and structured daily routines, like art and farming, could actually restore a person's mental balance.
And the architecture itself brilliantly illustrates exactly how Kirkbride put that theory into practice. The floor plan utilizes this unique, staggered, batwing or V-shaped formation, which is known as an N-echelon arrangement. It was specifically engineered so that every single connecting wing of the hospital received an absolute abundance of therapeutic natural sunlight and fresh cross breezes. It wasn't just a building, it was essentially a massive medical instrument, a special apparatus for healing.
And the sheer monumental scale of this architecture is literally hard to wrap your head around. Construction began in 1858, and to this day it remains the largest hand-cut stone masonry building in North America. It was designed to be completely self-sufficient too. We're talking its own farm, a dairy, its own water supply. It was meant to be a vast, insular world of total comfort and order.
But the descent from this utopian vision happened surprisingly fast, and it really started with who was being led in the doors. Patient records reveal some truly bizarre reasons for admission. Asthma, indigestion, insubordinate wives, getting kicked in the head by a horse. The admissions criteria were just incredibly loose. Husbands could admit their wives for almost any reason and simply leave them there as wards of the state. Because of this, people were being locked up for ailments that had absolutely nothing to do with mental illness.
So, as you can probably guess, this incredibly broad admission standard caused the population to absolutely skyrocket. This massive building was originally designed to comfortably house just 250 patients, but by the 1950s, that number had swelled to a staggering 2,600 people.
The reality of that kind of severe overcrowding completely destroyed Kirkbride's original vision of individualized, dignified care. The hospital became so packed, the staff literally had to implement 8-hour bed sharing shifts. That means a patient was essentially given a bed for exactly 8 hours of rest, and then they had to get up and vacate it just so someone else could sleep.
And where you have extreme overcrowding, terrible understaffing, and severe mental illness, you unfortunately breed horrific violence. Staff were empowered to lock patients away in solitary confinement in an area reserved for the most unruly of the unruly. In one chilling incident noted by historians, a patient was murdered by his own bunkmates. They placed his head under a bed frame and repeatedly jumped on it. It had become a chaotic, terrifying environment completely detached from any concept of healing.
Desperate to somehow manage this ballooning, unmanageable population, the state turned to extreme medical measures. And this brings us to the transorbital lobotomy. Popularized by neurologist Dr. Walter Freeman, this was a really crude surgery where an ice pick-like instrument was inserted under the eyelid and into the brain cavity to sever neural connections in the prefrontal cortex. The goal? It was intended to quickly make uncontrollable patients docile so they could simply be discharged.
I want you to just pause on this number for a second. 787.
In the summer of 1952, the West Virginia lobotomy project was launched to test the effectiveness of this surgery on a mass scale. Over just 3 years, Dr. Freeman and his team lobotomized 787 West Virginians across the state's mental hospitals. That was the highest number per capita in the United States. Many of these patients never even consented, and the procedure often left them totally devoid of their personality and basic functioning.
But you know what's truly terrifying about this mass medical experiment? The underlying economics. Dr. Freeman performed these life-altering, identity-erasing procedures for just $25 a patient. It was seen as a fast, cheap solution to the massive financial burden the state was facing from overcrowded wards. In Freeman's eyes, the operation didn't even require a proper operating room or full surgical training.
So, looking back, the lifespan of this institution maps out a pretty tragic arc. Construction began in 1858, and it opened to patients right in the middle of the Civil War in 1864. It hit its agonizing peak of overcrowding in the 1950s, but eventually the introduction of psychotropic medications, changing philosophies toward community-based care, and the severe physical decay of the building itself finally forced its doors permanently shut. In 1994, the hospital officially closed.
But surprisingly, that is not the end of the story. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum entered an entirely new era. Today, it's experienced this controversial rebirth as a privately owned tourist attraction. It sits at this really fascinating intersection of historical preservation and what scholars call dark tourism, which is essentially tourism directed to places that are identified with death, disaster, and suffering.
And this new afterlife presents a massive ethical dilemma. On the one hand, private tourism is funding the vital historic preservation of a stunning architectural marvel, and it's bringing much-needed jobs to the local West Virginia economy. But on the other hand, critics worry that charging admission to walk the halls where people actively suffered turns profound historical trauma into what one scholar calls a commercial playground of fetishized disability. You can see this ethical balancing act play out perfectly in the actual menu of tours offered to visitors today. They have rigorous heritage and history tours that dive deeply into the Kirkbride architecture and the genuine medical history, but right alongside them you have the criminally insane tours, all-night ghost hunts, and even zombie paintball. The site is actively catering to both serious historians and true crime thrill seekers at the exact same time. Honestly, nothing captures these clashing narratives better than the gift shop. Right there, among the historical literature, you can find a souvenir water bottle with this exact quote on it: "Stop stigmatizing and embrace your crazy." It perfectly illustrates the tightrope the site walks, trying to promote a modern message of mental health acceptance while simultaneously marketing the sensationalized, spooky aesthetic of craziness to sell tickets and merchandise.
Now, as fascinating as the asylum's current use is, we have to step back and ask a much broader, heavier societal question. When this massive hospital finally closed in 1994, where did all those thousands of patients actually go? Well, this brings us to a phenomenon called trans-institutionalization. It's defined as the demographic shift of mentally ill populations completely out of psychiatric hospitals and straight into the criminal justice system. Today, while the Grand Asylum sits mostly empty as a ghost-haunted tourist attraction, just 40 miles southeast sits the Huttonsville Correctional Center. It's the oldest and largest prison in West Virginia, housing well over 1,000 inmates. Scholars point out that as the grand state hospitals closed their doors across the country, massive state prisons quietly took their place as the primary housing for the severely mentally ill.
The result of this shift is just a staggering reality. Today, mentally ill individuals in America are roughly 20 times more likely to be incarcerated in a prison than they are to be receiving care in a psychiatric hospital. The Grand Asylum is gone, sure, but the population it was built to serve is now simply locked behind a completely different set of walls.
Which really leaves us with this final, lingering question. As we look back at the rise and fall of the Kirkbride Asylums, have we actually reformed how we treat our most vulnerable citizens? Or did we simply move them out of sight, trading the hospital ward for the prison cell? It's a really complex history that forces us to look in the mirror at our society today. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope it sparked your curiosity to go out and learn more.